Okay, we have Chapter 8 review exercises, question E75. And I think this one's a pretty interesting question because we have a large, this is real data, a large sample, 54,000 respondents. We're picking up both English and Spanish speakers, so that's nice. It's our generalization is going to be wider. And we're trying to find out the religious beliefs of adults. So you may ask yourself before looking into this, what percent of America do you think, or of the US, do you think believes in God or is a Christian or is different religions? So here we have 74% identified themselves as Christian. Compute a 95% confidence interval for the proportion of Americans who would identify themselves as Christian. Okay, so we're going back to confidence interval. I'm going to use this same, notice this is the little thing I set up in Excel for testing, doing an actual inference test, but most of it can be used with just some slight adjustments. So we have now a sample of, whoops, not that much, 54,000 people. Our estimated P just happens to be the same amount that it was in the previous problem that I used this for. What's our P naught in here? So you may look around, what's the null hypothesis proportion? And eventually you'll realize, oh, there is no null hypothesis proportion because that's not actually what's being done here. So I'm going to put that in red. We're not actually conducting a hypothesis test. Standard error, this right here is based on this null hypothesis, so I do need to change this so that we're looking at 0.7. Actually, let me do even better. We're looking at this number times 1 minus this number. Okay, and let's see if I got enough parentheses in there. I did. Okay, because of this beautiful sample size, especially if that's random, and it says you may consider this, which makes me think it probably wasn't, and it would be hard to get a truly random sample of that. But assuming that it is, we're going to have a very low standard error, which is wonderful. Remember, low standard error means that we have zoomed in on the true proportion. So even though 0.74 is our estimate, it's actually a very good estimate. And so we need to go, instead of using this C5, which had been, we're actually using C4 because that is our sample. Same thing down here. Okay. And this I'm also going to highlight to show that we're not looking at it. So this red means that it's not applicable to us here. So in this right here we have a confidence interval between 0.736 and 0.744, which is the values here. We are doing two-sided. Typically when you do a confidence interval, typically you do a two-sided because you're getting an estimate proportion, and it could be plus or minus in either direction. So that's very standard to do. What's the margin of error for the proportion estimated? In other words, we're going to put forth this claim that 74% of the US is Christian, and that's our best guess. But we're also aware that it may not be exactly that. So how far are we off? Well, we can do that a couple different ways. One way we could do it is just look at 1.96 times the standard error, and that would give us the 0.04. We could also subtract the 0.74 from this, or take 0.74 minus this. In other words, the distance between the estimate and either one of the boundaries would also give you the margin of error. So a few different ways to compute that. And we have 1,000 respondents who said, regarding the existence of God, do you think blah, blah, blah. So the question is there is definitely a personal God. So how are we feeling about that statement? There's no such thing. There's no way to know. I'm not sure. There is a higher power, but no personal God. So you can see here, this is not only did 74% say that they identified themselves as Christian, but 69.5% said that there's definitely a personal God. Notice also that this 100% is among, I guess it's among the entire sample. I was wondering if this was going to be among just the Christians, which would tell me that this 69.5% is not necessarily all inside of this 74% that is responding to be Christian, right? So there may be some of the people who did not consider themselves a Christian and yet said that there is definitely a personal God. So just to make that clear. So the question now is, if you're interested in the proportion of Americans who respond, there is definitely a personal God right here, what is the margin of error for this portion of the poll? So notice now our sample size is only 1,000, and our estimated p for this particular question is 0.695. Okay, our standard error is quite a bit higher here, and we're looking for the margin of error, which would be 1.96 times the standard error, which was right here what we got for this margin of error. Notice that because I'm using the reference addresses for the cells, I'm using C6 instead of typing in what that number actually was. Every time I put in a new sample size and proportion, everything else updates automatically. So now I know that my margin of error there is almost 3%, quite a bit higher than this one. Why? Because our sample size is much, much lower. So in other words, although I'm pretty sure it's 74% that believe or that identify themselves as Christian, the amount that believe in a personal God is going to be between 66 and 72%. So I'm much wider range there of potential choices, but it still gives you a sense that it should be 2/3 or higher that do believe in a personal God.